Kena kutu, tena kutu, kena kutu katoa. Hello to one, hello to two, hello to all in Maori. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, which is the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders, past and present, extending that respect to the elders of all Indigenous people here today. Niomai, Haromai. So, yes, my name's Dr. JJ Eldridge. It's good to meet you all. It's good to be here and talk to you about something that is quite cool. And it's quite exciting. I love giving this talk. Before we go further on, Peter's already talked about this in terms of who I am. I did my physics in undergrad in Cambridge, a postdoc in Paris, which was not the best of time, but that was because it was in Paris. Belfast was great. I absolutely loved it. And it's just really because different departments have different cultures, and sometimes you fit that culture. I didn't necessarily fit in Paris, but in Belfast, I absolutely loved it. Postdoc back in Cambridge for 4 years, which was really productive, and that led to lectureship in Auckland, which was made for family reasons. And I've been there for 56 months so far. Not that I'm counting down to when I can apply for citizenship at all or something. And it's important when you have this description of when people are going on through their life and their academic career, you realize other things happen during that time. Okay, so it's actually quite normal to actually then go and have another life outside of that academic track of your CV, so other things happen, black belts, marriage, children, etc. So that's the CV version of who I am. The CV version, or who actually am I, is a different question, and that's something that is developing and ongoing, and it's a personal journey for me. I don't know what the answer is yet. But my name is Dr. JJ Eldridge. I prefer them, they pronouns. I know that's very difficult. Okay, I'm not going to worry if you do misgender me with your pronouns, but that's just something we'll come to later on in the talk. I'm an astrophysicist. I do like the idea of using physics. My training, my undergrad, was in a physics degree, and I think it's important to recognise that that's a different way of thinking about looking at the universe to other cases. I work on stars, galaxies, and supernovae, as was mentioned, and I'm a co-PI of the BPASS project. And I read and watch way too much science fiction. Okay, I'll show you in a second the excerpt from my PhD thesis, which tells you exactly why I started becoming an astronomer. And I've been very out about being gender fluid or transgender for about a year or two now. You can track back on Twitter to see when I started coming out on Twitter. Of course, though, you always come out in different stages. You come out to your friends, your family, in other ways. What is BPASS, which is the one question you're probably all asking. It's binary population spectral synthesis, so this is great. I get to say the phrase like, in astrophysics, every stellar system is probably a binary, and if you're ignoring it, you're ignoring a large amount of stuff. So everything is binary except for gender. Gender is not a binary male-female, there's a range of binaries. So I'm responsible for all the stellar models, population synthesis, and the coding. And Elizabeth is actually really good because she's been working with me on this project in terms of she was the one who actually recommended and suggested, you've got these stellar models, why not predict what a galaxy looks like? It's such a simple thing to say, but it actually didn't occur to me. So we actually started looking at high redshift galaxies, which is where her field is, and that's where we still kind of, our main research lies. I've got 3 PhD students, Liam, Lynn, and John. If you're going to the ASA next week, you can hear their talks. They're all coming up to finishing now and rapidly trying to write papers and write up their thesis, but they're all doing great. There's also a lot of other people who have had big input into BPASS, but I'm not going to be discussing that today. That's another talk for tomorrow. So while I've got this research going on, since becoming a lecturer in Auckland, I've really got involved in equity. I'm on the Faculty of Science Equity Committee, but just after I joined, I learned about a new initiative where the university was setting up an LGBTI network for staff and students. So this is a university-wide network which was just trying to bring together all the students and staff who are part of the rainbow community. And so that's that sticker there, and we have these stickers you can stick on your office to show that that's a safe space. The really cool thing is over the 3 or 4 years this has been running, we now have faculty groups or rainbow groups in every faculty. Okay, we thought we'd never get into business and law, but we do. And that's great because while you've got this university-wide scheme, in each faculty you can speak to someone who's in your field. Okay, you can see yourself and others like you in your subject, and I think that's really important. So Rainbow Science is cool, and we have these great logo with all the different sciences there. You can have fun trying to work out which science is which. I'm not too sure what physics is, but we have a radio telescope, which is obviously astronomy. Then because the trans and gender diverse people within the Rainbow group have different needs to the majority of the rest of it. The LGBTI group has always been mainly dominated by lesbian and gay individuals, and the other groups tend to somewhat be forgotten. That's changing now. But in Auckland, a group of students decided to set up trans on campus, which is actually a great idea that there we've actually made a lot of changes in Auckland, which I won't go into, but it's things like getting the university to pay for name changes, because you want students not to be outed in, say, when a class roll is going on. So you actually help those students change their name legally so that that doesn't happen. And there's a number of other things that are important for safety, such as toilets, that the university has been able to achieve. And just to point out, the first time I actually lectured as my female self, I was here in Monash. I don't think it was this exact room, it was one of the other ones. That was at the Anita Summer School last year. So, Monash has had a role to play in my journey too. Okay, so why am I giving a talk about science fiction? Well, here's an excerpt from my thesis. My thesis acknowledgements ran to 3 pages. You don't need to try and break that record, but I actually made some people cry in a good way reading my acknowledgements, but not reading this paragraph. Okay, and you can see here that one of the reasons why I got into astronomy, or perhaps the primary reason I got into astronomy, is throughout my life I've always been really interested in science fiction. Okay, I wanted to go and study the stars, I wanted to go and study other planets, but you can't. Okay, special relativity, damn. But astronomy is as close as you can get to actually doing, like going to voyaging to other planets, and that's why I actually like astronomy. You can also trust what I'm saying, because I've been to a few science fiction conventions. I've consulted with the biggest experts in science fiction, as you can see. Here's the 5 doctors. Okay, so I tried to get my head of department to pay for this, like saying, I use this in lectures. Surely you should pay for this $400 ticket to go as a gold member to the Doctor Who conference. He said no, but it was worth the money. So, what we're going to do in this talk is we're going to use science fiction stories to discuss good and bad science in terms of gender changes within stories. But hopefully, so as an example of how to use science fiction to teach things that are difficult to understand. And it's easy because science fiction is so diverse. There's so many different stories, and you can take those and you can tell a story and maybe make you think about things in a different way. So we're going to try and do that. One problem, of course, of science fiction, and is why when you read a lot of these talks, people take the view that, oh, it can't be done, it's all wrong, and this is why. Let's not take that negative view. Let's be positive. Let's think, okay, so what do we know about physics and science that could actually make this work? Okay, sometimes we can't, so we have to say it's rubbish. But, sometimes let's try and be much more positive. I wrote a blog post on the Starkiller base from The Force Awakens in Star Wars, and people said, I like this, not because you took it down, but because you said, how could it work? Does the energy work out? Can you blow up numerous planets by using the energy from the sun? And yeah, so anyway, as I said, the problem is that a lot of things have to be invented to tell a story that are impossible. Okay, so we will recognize that. But you get around that, okay, because if you, for example, in most science fiction, if you couldn't travel faster than light, there's no story. Okay, so there are some things that sometimes you do, and you just say, what could happen if this could happen? And remember, this is a talk in development. Although it's about the 4th or 5th time I've given the talk, there's still some things that are changing as I go on, because I don't think I've got quite there the best way of telling it. Right, first off though, I just wanted to highlight some of the other things you can do with science fiction. Okay, so I'm taking an idea of talking about gender diversity, but you can of course also do physics. Okay, and you're a physics department, and I can really suggest there are some really obvious things you can do. Okay, so I'm just going to show 2 quick examples. One is this, okay, does anyone recognize what movie that's from?
Is it Avatar?
It is Avatar, yes. Well done. No chocolate fish, sorry. Do you do chocolate fishes in Australia too? Oh, okay, that's a New Zealand, that's a Kiwi thing, so sorry. Chocolate frogs, okay. Chocolate, amphibious, watery, anyway. So yes, exactly, it's from Avatar. And the thing is, you can see here is you can immediately see lots of things you can talk about. Why are these engines so big? It's an interstellar spacecraft, it needs to get up to high accelerations. We don't know exactly how they work, I haven't looked into it, I don't know if anyone's actually written a Science of Avatar book yet. But these are obviously very big engines because it needs to get up to a large velocity of light. You have in the actual movie 2 centrifugal bins that orbit round, so the crew that don't go into hibernation can actually still have some gravity. So there's one thing you can discuss there. Of course, the engines are very far away from the living quarters because these are probably quite radioactive and quite nasty. What's this? Does anyone know? Did anyone remember from the movie what that is at the front? It's a mirror. Why would you have a mirror on a spacecraft? Sorry? Is my hair up? No. Is that a comment? No. It's a solar cell. Okay, you're leaving the solar system, you can fire a laser at the spacecraft as it's leaving the solar system to speed it up. And then at the place where it's going to, you can fire a laser from the planet it's going to then slow it down. Okay, and so immediately you can see just with one picture, you can teach out some very interesting physical concepts. Hopefully, maybe. Okay. Also, because even just the sun that the system's entering or going to, it would, again, the cell would be there. I'm guessing here, I don't know, I haven't read the science of the science fiction of Avatar. But, you're physicists, you can look at this. And it's like, let's not say like how terrible it is. Let's think what's actually could be done. But you don't have to just go for movies. You can also play computer games. Okay? So this is Mars. Okay? It's a great game from it's maybe a decade old now called UFO Aftermath. And the idea is that there's a colony on Mars, and you've got to try and destroy these aliens. So it's one of these combat simulations where you've got to have your troops and go out and take on aliens. It's a great game, and I played it for weeks just to be able to do this talk. Obviously. And the idea is you've got the water and the ice caps, so you have an aquifer to get the water down to your habitat. And so while there's combat, the idea is you've also got to terraform Earth. Okay, so again, you can actually talk about planets. You can talk about terraforming. And the really cool thing about this game is they actually do it quite accurately, because you've got the northern continent oceans, you've got the Valley Maranus, is it? Whichever valley it is on Mars, I've forgotten now, that has a very deep lake, and that's Mars terraformed close towards the end of the game. So again, there's stuff here you can talk about, planets and habitability by using computer games and science fiction. And a number of times I've given a talk on exoplanets, and little kids come up, ask afterwards saying, what game was that? And you can get it on Steam. So, I've just destroyed many people's PhDs, obviously. Right. Okay, so let's get back to the idea of gender diversity. And I just want to break through a few definitions. So these are terms that I will even get them confused, because it's very confusing when you're talking about sex and gender. Okay, so again, this is one, when I first gave this talk, it was pointed out by the audience. I was getting these two mixed up, which is a common thing. Okay, so it's actually quite difficult, even though this is quite simple. Okay, so when I say sex, I'm referring to the sex that people are assigned at birth. Okay, i.e. in terms of their reproductive capability. Are they male, female, or intersex? Yes, that's right, and there's more than just those two sexes. Okay, and there are a range of behaviors and expressions of how your genetic code's encoded. And even this is actually an area of interesting research, because people have been discovered where they have different chromosomal expressions within their own body. So some of their cells have XX, and some of their cells have XY. So, this is still research, and we're probably underestimating the number of intersex people in society today. But gender refers to the social construct that people would like to present as. Okay, so obviously at the moment I'm trying to present as female, and sometimes that gender and that sex align. And when the gender and sex align, you're cisgender, okay, because that means same. It's not a dirty word, it's just a line saying you're normal, okay, for some certain values of normal. But transgender individuals are where the gender they wish to express and their sex are not aligned, okay, because you're different. And that's just where that word comes from. Okay, so I do identify as transgender, but not in the way that you want to go from one to the other. I'll come to that in a second. As I said again, intersex persons do not have a clear sex based on some of the characteristics, just reaffirming that first point. But of course that's interesting, because then what gender do they want to be? And one of the issues that's coming apparent now is the medicalization of intersex behavior means that a doctor basically guesses which sex you should be. And that is probably often wrong. So there's this issue of, this is a case of, if you have an intersex child, you shouldn't actually intervene until they get to decide what gender they want to be. But yes, there's also gender diversity and non-binary persons. Okay, so gender does not have to be a binary. You do not, just like sex doesn't have to be this binary of male and female, and there is a mix in the middle. There is also a mix in the middle of gender. And there's always a range of male behavior, and there's a range of female behavior. So the idea that there's some overlap in the middle should not be a surprise to anyone. I myself am gender fluid, so if you invite me for a talk, you never know who you're going to get. Speaker roulette. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm trying not to be the really annoying person that always goes, but gender isn't binary. When you see speaker breakdowns and you see male, female, and everyone worries about the fact the number of female speakers, the number of female lecturers. You can have another option, and you only have to have that other option and have one person ticket for that to have been to be worthwhile. Okay, the rates to explode a few myths. I'm not going to go on about this too much. But I've already covered these. If you want to find out more about all the myths that you can bust, you can go to a blogspot, because we wrote a myth-busting article from Chance on Campus for our student magazine during Pride Week. But the key thing here is the numbers of trans individuals. So at a recent survey of schools in Australia, they asked, are you transgender? of like a few thousand students, and about 1.2% said yes. And a further 2.5% said, I'm not sure, I'm questioning my gender. And so this is the first time that we've actually probably getting to the right area where we are getting an indication of how many people who live outside the normal gender binary. And these numbers come important for later on when we look at some interesting science fiction shows. And the last one is that not everyone wants to transition, okay? Which is an important point. Okay, and there's different types of transitions. There's social transitions where you're just presenting as the other gender, and there's also medical transitions. If you ever meet a transgender person, don't ask them about their medical history. You do not have a right to do that. Anyway, okay, that's quite heavy. Sorry, let's get on with some science fiction. When I started writing this talk, I went off and did what everyone does and do a Google search on TV tropes. And it's actually an entire website about all the TV tropes you can possibly have. So it's really good if you want to write your own TV program. You can just go and get all the tropes you can copy. Now, there are 3 main laws of gender changes. And the first is that male to female trans instants in fiction are more common and more permanent than female to male. I have no idea why that is. It's just that it always is, and it's probably because it's funnier in society. A fictional character that gets his or her gender changed often becomes gradually accustomed to life as a new man or woman. Eventually, they are likely to experience an epiphany that they are better off in their new gender than they ever were in their old one. I don't know why that would be, but in society, we know this is wrong. Okay, why do you have transgender individuals? Because they feel that the gender they want to express themselves is wrong to the sex. This would never happen. Okay, if we took your brain and put it into a body of the opposite sex, you would want to go back to the the sex that aligns with your gender and your brain. Because just by being in a different body, that's not going to change your gender. And any gender-bent character will either embrace their change or be subject to all the stereotypical events associated with their new gender, which is kind of depressing. And again, it's there for comedy. But interestingly, in science fiction, when I started looking at this, I thought, like, okay, and there's going to be lots of examples of this in science fiction. It doesn't appear to be that case. They appear to actually do it a bit more sensitively, as I'll hopefully show you. Although there is often the odd trope and there is the odd bit of stupidity and misogyny in the way they do it. I'm thinking here in terms of also, normally if they are in normal TV programs, it's some sort of magic why it happens, or it's like they have to pretend to be a woman to get in. There was Sorority Boys, a movie where they had to pretend to be women to get into a sorority and go to university in America. But anyway, how do gender swaps normally happen in science fiction shows? And the main way is just in mind swapping. So this is basically magic. This is physically impossible. Okay, but it's a really good thing because in science fiction you can have a magical box and just say it's technology. Okay, one of Clarke's third laws, the Clarke's third law is that any sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic. So here we have the case, you can go through any science fiction show, at some point they've done this. Here is the case, it's in the final season of Star Trek, the original series. Captain Kirk has his mind swapped by some wall. It's not even a box, it's just a wall that you stand on, and you swap bodies and, minds with the other person. Your spirit is transferred. And this actress is actually the best person ever to have played Captain Kirk, which is kind of... you're watching this interrogation scene where this is the woman who's interrogating Captain Kirk, and she is getting very emotional, and he's just getting completely straight, and how Captain Kirk should be, going oh, you're wrong. And it's just, why can't William Shatner normally play Captain Kirk like that? Anyway. And it was just dealt with sensitively, this issue of the fact there was no tropes, and there was no, Captain Kirk didn't, you think Captain Kirk, anyway, there was no silliness or misogyny, it was just treated like, oh, this is just fine, there's no problem. Although sometimes in Futurama and other things, it has been done differently, and also in Stargate, it's happened a few times. And it's normally a magic box, okay, so this is why it says at the bottom bad. We've talked about it, let's go and look and see what the science says. And in the programs, there's always a magic box. They never actually invent it, okay? And the accuracy is bad because you've got to think, okay, what actually are you in your brain? You're a bunch of protein structures with neurons firing all over, okay? And so if you actually wanted to recreate your brain and your personality and you in another brain, you'd actually have to rearrange that other brain to be exactly identical to the one in your own head, okay? And that's impossible, because you'd have to somehow rearrange all the structure, and you have no idea if the same number of neurons are in your head or in somebody else's head. Okay, and it's not like it's always shown in these movies. It's not just some sort of spirit. It's actually a structural change. Right? So there's one problem. The other problem is, how much information is stored in the structure of your brain. If you try to, it's almost like an argument against matter transportation. The amount of information encoded in the structure of your body, we do not have the computational resources on the planet to be able to store that. So this is actually a computer problem as well as a physics problem, as well as a structural problem. So it can't actually happen. If you wanted to see how it works in the, we'll see this diagram a few times. So normally in the science fiction shows, it's always where you have the two people and you have some magic box or science. And you've got these two spirits. And all that happens is they touch the box and kapow, they change. Sometimes the complication is that you can't actually change, but so once it's changed, you can't change back. So that adds up some very interesting mathematical problems of how you have the smallest number of changes to get people back to where they were. I think Futurama did that when they did this episode. And again, the reason why I've got these star symbols is because it's the indication that it's a spirit, whereas that's not actually what you are, although we don't actually really understand where consciousness come from, so who knows. Maybe it's right, but I would guess not. So the accuracy of this sort of mind swapping is bad. There's one quite funny thing. I was trying to find some instances of misogyny in science fiction, and this is about as close as I got, which is in Farscape, when it's called Out of Their Minds. I haven't actually seen this episode yet, but I am rewatching Farscape from the beginning, so I will get around to it. And you can see it's, so they actually have to put the photos of the person who's in that body on front of them so they don't get confused. So John Crichton, the main male lead, is on the body of Aaron's son, and Aaron, whose body this is in Rigel's body. So you can see how it would have got quite confusing. But here they're going like, oh, come on, man, they're here, they're right here, and they've been here for a couple of hours. I just had to, you are mentally deranged, okay, because John's talking about Aaron's body, and she doesn't like the idea of him touching certain things. And John says, I'm a guy, and a guy dreams about this sort of thing. I'll tell you one thing, Crichton, if I find you've been dreaming about anything else in my body, I'll break your legs, even if they are mine. Okay, which is quite good, because even though it's trying to touch on misogyny, at least it shows you that Aaron's not going to take any of it. So, yes. Right. So there's this idea that you can swap your mind and body, and in some ways, for a transgender individual, that would be really good, just be able to swap into a new body. Of course, you'd always have the problem that that body wouldn't necessarily look like you. Okay, how do you recognize yourself when you wake up in the morning? And we'll get into some of these other issues later on when we look more transplants in a minute. What about aliens? Are there any aliens we can actually look at that tell us something interesting about gender? And this is actually suggested by the other person who runs Rainbow Science, and it's the Trill in Star Trek. And it's a brilliant idea because they're very interesting. Okay, have we got many Trekkies in the audience? No, yes, we've got one. Okay, that's okay, you can admit that. I'm a Trekkie too. Everyone else is going to keep quiet. So parasites and symbiotes are interesting, and so Stargate also has this, but it's never explored it to the same degree. I can remember about one throwaway comment where they had this, where there was a change of gender for one of the Gould, which is you have, for the Gould and Tokara, you have basically a slimy, parasitic, scorpion-esque snake that jumps in through your mouth and attaches itself to your brain, and it takes control of you. And so that's in control, and it's not like a symbiosis. But with the Trill in Star Trek, you have like a large slug that gets put into your abdominal cavity and attaches to your spinal column. Now the different thing here is with the Tolkaran's Gould, the Gould is completely in control. So that's the one that decides what it's going to do. With the Trill, each time they merge, you have some difference between the way that the host and the symbiote merge their personalities. So this is very interesting because this makes you start thinking that, of course, when you have a newborn symbiote put in a new person, say that person's male, that symbiote is obviously going to become male, okay, because he doesn't know any different. What happens, though, that when that host dies and the same symbiote is transferred into a new body, okay, and say that's a woman, that symbiote then becomes something quite different because this symbiote is going to have a lot of male memories and yet it's in a woman's body. So what gender does this person become? And then, of course, it gets complicated because then you go to your third body, and so you have 3 sets of memories or 3 sets of experiences as different genders, and then, you know, this one combined person then becomes very different. And one of the best examples is Jadzia Dax in Deep Space Nine, And of course, the interesting thing here, Benjamin Sisko, who was the captain, knew the symbiote from a previous life when he was Curzon Dax, very gregarious ambassador, a male ambassador. And so, he always goes around calling Jadzia Dax old man. Okay, so it's interesting, how do you interact with somebody who's now a man when you knew there's a woman? Okay, which is sometimes very different if you ever have to deal with someone who's transitioned, right? It's still the same person, but there is still something changed about them. They do explore in Next Generation this in one episode, where it's a case of it was Beverly Crusher falls in love with a man and then it becomes a woman. And she says, perhaps it's a human failing, but we are not accustomed to these rapid changes. I can't keep up. How long will you have this one host? What will the next one be? I can't live with that kind of uncertainty. Perhaps someday our ability to love won't be so limited. So she was actually in love with the male host, but because it's the gender of the person has changed, they no longer are attracted to that, and she can't deal with that. And of course, that does happen with transgender individuals today as well. The one that was really brave when they explored it was Deep Space Nine. And here Jadzia Dax meets, so I had to get this right. So Dax used to be in a different host, which is Jadzia's symbiote, and they were male, and they were married to Linara. And then after 2 hosts later, Dax goes into Jadzia, and they have to work together on a scientific project. Now this is unusual because in the Trill lore, they're not meant to have another relationship. But the attraction, because the host of the symbiote died rapidly, they didn't get a chance to say goodbye. And so the attraction is still there. And a lot of the actual episode is just about, like, if they have this relationship, they're excluded from Trill society. And both the symbiotes never get a new host. So, the question is love worth it? Even though, you're going to end the lives of the 2 symbiotes when the lives of these 2 people die. And it was the first lesbian kiss in Star Trek. And it was interesting because there's other episodes where that could have happened in Star Trek, but they didn't. It's just interesting how Star Trek sort of is not always ahead of society, but doesn't tend to try and push the limits too far. But that was interesting, because then that was the first time, Star Trek, it's okay to have gender and sexual diversity. Right. To go on some other aliens that may be quite obvious and is quite in the public, well, I don't say public eye, but being thought of a lot recently. Time Lords. Okay, so the amount of debate that I'm sure is going on Doctor Who email discussion lists and things about this is probably crazy. Okay, because actually it was a brilliant insight. It was just to try and turn Missy, who was the villain of one of the seasons, and like nobody got this right. I think a few people maybe suggested, oh, maybe it's the Master. But it was this concept, because it was introduced in one episode that the Corsair used to change their gender all the time. But you have Time Lords, and so the Master has all these male faces, and then suddenly he's become a woman, which is kind of interesting. Then Doctor has to deal with his arch nemesis. So yeah, who's changed gender. Now the problem, I didn't realize this, it was somebody in a talk who pointed out to me this. This reinforces the gender binary, because Time Lords can only either be male or female. There's no one in between, which is interesting. Although they do suggest that you can have gender fluid Time Lords, because there was a throwaway line by the Doctor saying, the Corsair, they used to change their gender all the time. You was never too sure what they were, which is also quite good. You could also look at the Russell T Davies era of Doctor Who when it was rebooted. Didn't deal with trans people so well, and there was a number of instances of where it was trans-misogynistic. But they've actually got a lot better now, and actually Stephen Moffat, just to even do this is quite good. And of course, in the last episode, there was a general who changed from being a man to a woman, and she complained about that's the first time I've been a man. How do you cope all the time? Anyway, so there's lots of quotes you can put onto this, and of course the Doctor really didn't know and couldn't think that Missy was actually the Master, his arch nemesis, who they've always known. And there's also funny throwaway lines. I'm not too sure exactly how good this is, but you're a Time Lord, Time Lady, thank you. Some of us can afford the upgrade. And it's quite good. It just gives that. It's still the same sort of character. You can tell but there's an element of fun in the Master that I don't think has been in some of the actors before. So there we've been talking about male and female, and again we're still talking about these same 2 binary sexes and the same 2 binary genders. The question is, does sci-fi consider any more diverse genders or sexes? And this is interesting, because then you have to start going into a different area of science to actually say, should we be able to include this? Because now we need to start thinking about evolution. Why do we have 2 sexes anyway? First single-cell organisms that would have evolved would have actually been single-sex. So why is there an evolutionary advantage from having 2 sexes? So, what happens if you go to 3 or 4? Is that evolutionary advantageous? So we'll see. I haven't looked at these 2 cartoons, but just to highlight, there are some cartoons, and it's funny, these are for kids, right? And there is gender diversity in here. In the Steven universe, most of the characters and the, I can't think what they're called now, are actually meant, expressly said by the creators to be gender fluid. And so they're not too sure what the genders are, apart from some of them other main characters. And then there's also Shi Pao, which is where a schoolboy inherits his grandmother's special magic ring that gives him superpowers, except he has to be a girl with superpowers. And of course, that examines some of the fact that he wants to make sure that remains hidden so all his friends don't know he's a superhero. But in terms of Star Trek again, because Star Trek's great, there are so many cases where Star Trek have done things that enable you to look at gender diversity. And this is where those numbers earlier on come into play. So there was one episode called The Outcast, where the Star Trek crew are helping an androgynous species, so everybody's androgynous. They've evolved beyond gender, okay, which is maybe a high level of development, I don't know. And they don't have any female-male identities, so everyone is genderless. The problem is a few percent of the population do have those genders, and they're degenerate because they're lower life forms, because they go back to where they used to be, having male and female genders. Riker, being the Lothario of the Next Generation episode, there's always one in each Star Trek series, right? One you have to keep an eye out for. It was Kirk, then it was Riker. Anyway, so Riker and Soren, one of the people who has a female identity, have a relationship, but she's discovered by the Janai government and is forced to have psychokinetic therapy. And so doesn't understand that Riker actually breaks Prime Directive, goes to try and rescue her and bring her out and be the dashing hero, but she doesn't understand anymore why she would be attracted to a male, because she's androgynous. Why this was a brave episode and why a lot of people in the rainbow community liked it is because it has scary parallels to how you see these cases of people being forced to go to camps or to programs to try and cure them of their homosexuality or their transgenderedness. And when you actually look at the numbers from the TV show, it was like 97% of people in this society were androgynous. There was only a few percent that were male or female, whereas in our society, it's about 97% are male or female, and a few percent are in the middle. So this is actually a really good accuracy, not because the science works out. It's quite similar to what we have today. It's just the numbers are different. Okay, and you can see how the different society, it's always the dominant society, try to take control and say that's normal, whereas having a little bit of diversity and a little bit of difference is actually really good. One thing that's interesting I find about this is Jonathan Frakes reckons that Soren should have been more male. It was played by a female actress, and maybe it should have been played by a male actress. But considering we just talked about how Jadzia had the first lesbian kiss within, or same-sex kiss, I should say, sorry, within Deep Space Nine, they didn't want to do that earlier on in Star Trek Next Generation. So that's having other genders where it's androgynous, which would be a different gender to male and female, but it's still within that binary gender idea. But there's another couple of episodes, mainly in Star Trek Enterprise, where they do explore having completely different extra genders. So there's this idea in the Congenitor that there's 3% of the population or a third gender which are required to actually create a child. Okay, so a man and a woman can't actually have a child unless they have this third gender. The problem is that then those cogenitor people effectively become slaves, and they get shipped around from person to person and don't get actually taught anything, because they're just there to help make the next generation of children, which is quite sad. And of course, Trip, goes against the Prime Directive, upsets everyone, and the cogenitor ends up killing themselves because they realize what sort of life they're missing out on. And so the accuracy, I have no idea. I'm just going to say reasonable. The question you'd have to ask here is not whether this is physically possible, but whether there is an evolutionary advantage from having a third gender, which there may be. Okay, I can't think of any cases in our understanding of life at the moment, but at least you can say it's possible. They go one step further with Andorians, which is to say they have 4 genders, which is Than, Shen, Shen, and Zhen. Okay, so just add some more, and so you actually need 4 different contributors of genetic material to make a child. The interesting thing is this causes problems for the Andorians because their society's dying out, and this is actually reasonable because evolutionary. Why would you want 4 genders? It's the same. Can I make that analogy? This may be a good analogy, it may be a bad analogy. Say, for example, with hydrogen burning, right? You need to have 2 protons to stick together to make a new element, to make an isotope of deuterium before making the next things, right? The reason why the helium burning has to happen at a much, much higher temperature is because you need to have 3 things colliding together at the same time to form an element of carbon, or a nucleus of carbon. You know, it's not quite, you can see how it's the same argument. Okay, if you've got to have 3 people come together to make 1 baby, it's much more evolutionary difficult. If you've got to have 4 people coming together at the same time to make 1 child, that really is a stopgap and is like a rate limiting step on your population growth. And so in Star Trek, not in the TV series, but in the later books, they do actually point out the Andorians have to come out of the Federation because they just don't have enough people. They're a dying race. Okay. So that's a bit on gender diversity. Now we get onto the bit that could be considered gruesome. If you don't like the idea of head transplants, this is what we're going to talk about now. Okay, because this is the other thing. This is about the only other way that you can get a new body. It was discussed, of course, again in Star Trek, right? In Spock's brain, they transplant his brain from one place to the other. And this is, again, how you would actually do a mind swap, or how you would do a body swap. Okay, and there are a couple of problems with this. But here's the idea. You have 2 bodies, and you have 2 brains. Okay, not spirit this time, but this is how, if you wanted a different body, you'd actually have to do it. You'd have to have a donor body. You'd have to take that brain out, whether that other person liked it or not. And then, you know, you'd have this brain, and then you would transplant it. Oops, sorry, have I gone too far? Oh, no, hang on, sorry. I've got my colors mixed up. Okay, so you've got a green brain in here. You take the green brain out. You take your purple brain from here, and you put it into the new body, like that. Sorry. Okay, so, you know, this is in science fiction, but it's really impossible, okay? Because how do you connect your brain to the spinal column? You can probably hook up the blood vessels, okay? You know, a lot of development's been done on that, and transplant technology and surgery is actually really good. So you can probably do the blood vessels, but it's the spinal column, how do you connect that up? And so you'll never be able to actually, you'll be locked in. You'll never be able to see or feel or anything, apart from just think, if you actually ever wake up. This is the main plot of a book by Robert Heinlein, sorry, who is the same person, I think, who wrote Starship Troopers, if I remember correctly. It's called I Will Fear No Evil. And it's actually the worst book ever, because I haven't actually been able to get past about the first quarter of the book. What happens is the old rich man wants to have a brain transplant, because nobody wants to let him die because he's on life support. And so he says, oh, this is a good way of committing suicide, going for a brain transplant. A donor body comes up, and it's actually his secretary. And so his brain is transplanted, and he fully adjusts to being a woman. And is very happy in this. And it's just like, that would never happen. Okay, because we know it doesn't happen, because he would want, from his female body, he would want to have reassignment surgery to go back to being male, because, you know, if he's 100 years old and you've had 100 years experience of being a man, you will want to go back to being a man. You'll be set in your ways, maybe. And that's effectively the same thing what happens with a transgender individual. There are problems, as I say here. One problem we know from face transplants is that, you know, you have this new body and a new face, but is it still you? Will you be able to recognize yourself, assuming you can get over the problem of how you connect up the nerves? Will you actually feel like it's you? Okay, and there are known issues here that people who have face transplants have to have counseling to actually get around that. A problem is, where do you get the donor body from? There's no donor body shops. Okay, I mean, you'd also have to have like a really peculiar type of accident that just kills the brain and leaves the rest of the body untouched. So that would actually be quite rare. But technically it's possible. You could put a brain into another head, in theory, and you could live for a short while, but you'd have to have anti-rejection drugs for most of your life, and you don't know if you'd actually be locked in. So I'll say bad just because it's going to be quite difficult surgically. The one thing that, I don't know if anyone heard about this on the news, there is apparently a few doctors now going around saying like, oh, I'm going to transplant a head, which is, yeah. Okay, so the fact is, this has actually gone beyond science fiction, okay? But it was the main plot of X-Files, I Want to Believe. And they've also done it in Futurama, because Futurama's done it. And also Simpsons, right? Simpsons have probably done most of this as well, if you ever needed an excuse to call Simpsons science fiction. But the idea is just that one step more. Why do you have to reconnect your brain when you can just have 2 heads, and you cut one head off, obviously, and you transplant your old head onto a new body, okay? Now this is, I want to say, easier, because you've only got to try and connect 2 spinal columns together, okay, because you'd still be able to see and hear, because all your connections in your head will still be there. You'll be able to connect up, hopefully, the respiratory tract and the blood circulation, so it's slightly more possible, Okay, and the fact that doctors today, slightly crazy doctors, are saying they want to actually go and actually try and perform this, it says that it must at least be technically feasible today. But I don't think the person would actually live very long, and they'd probably still have the problem that you'd have this working head, but you wouldn't be able to get up and start walking around. Or if you did, it would be a lot of physiotherapy that you need to be able to learn how to use your new body. Okay, we can't even repair somebody's spinal column in the same body yet. I think we're getting close, because I keep on hearing like these stories about how it is getting close, but we'll see. And again, there is one problem, is where do you get the body from? You might have a different body, and it is possible. You'd have to have the anti-rejection drug for the rest of your life, though. So not so bad in terms of accuracy. The one thing that is worth noticing in X-Files, it was because they wanted to put a man's head onto a woman's body. So that was actually associated with a change of sex in that case. So yeah, but it was pretty gruesome. And there are cases where this has already been tested on animals. I wouldn't show any photos because I think some of those photos are quite upsetting. But when you do this, you know it has at least been tested and possible on animals. But let's say, okay, so let's say where we're going in the next 10, 20 years in terms of transplant technology, what's going on today in medicine that may make a change of sex much more easier than what's possible today, okay, to actually try and achieve some of the things they joke about in science fiction. So this has actually come out from when I give this talk and people always suggest, this could possibly happen. There's a Ian Banks story called the Culture Series, Player of Games, where you can manipulate your DNA over a year by taking tablets and change from male to female, or female to male, which is kind of interesting. I think that's a good idea, and in theory it's possible. And there are some cases in certain villages around the world where children do suddenly change their gender, change their sex from male to, I think it's from female to male, but that's just because it's a developmental issue, and it's not because of any strange medical thing, it's just the way that they develop. So this could be possible, but of course it's like probably centuries away because we just don't understand biology that well. I should say my wife is a developmental biologist, and so we have discussed this, and she was quite sure that it is like, yes, it's crazy. It's based in science that it could happen, but it is extremely way beyond how we can understand how bodies and how systems develop. But the one story we can look at is Options, which is a short story by John Varley, where he didn't really worry too much about why sex changes happen or how you would actually do them. He just said, what happens if they become cheap and accessible? So this is actually a very interesting gender equity story, that if people can change their sex quite easily, does that actually increase gender equity? Because you can actually become a man and you can become a woman and have to live in their other person or the other gender's shoes quite easily. And in the story, effectively what happens is they take a sample of your DNA, take a donor X or Y chromosome, and grow you a new body. And then the old body is kept in a tank. Now, I'll say this is not so bad. Why do I say it's not so bad? Because you wouldn't grow yourself a new body, because current medical research is, okay, that should say organ printing. For some reason, it's cut it off. But you can go on Wikipedia. When something has a Wikipedia page, it's actually not too crazy. Well, actually, that's probably wrong. Does John Latanzio have a Wikipedia page yet? Okay, I won't make one. But the idea is you have a printer, you have a 3D printer. Okay, now this is technologically difficult. Okay, we cannot print anything other than a bladder at the moment. But the idea is you have stem cells that you feed in the top, you then program those stem cells with the right markers to tell them how to develop, and you would print out a new organ. Or, in the future, 10, 20, 30 centuries in the future, you'll be able to print out a new body. Okay. But again, I'm just saying I'm extrapolating current technology a lot. So if you had options today, you wouldn't grow a new body, you could have a new body instantly. So you'd take your sample, you'd print out an entire body, you'd have to make some stem cells, it wouldn't be an instant job, but you'd be able to print out the body without a brain, and then you just transplant in your new brain. Okay, now that sort of concept is centuries away, but then what a trans man pointed out to me when I did do this story is that you can actually print out certain bits of like the body that you need. Okay, you don't actually anymore have to take what's there and try and turn it into the other gender. You can print out the bodies or the parts of the organs that you want from your, different sex you want to go to, and then they can be implanted. Why is this important? That it's printed from your own stem cells, you don't get any rejection issues. So those organ printing devices, we all wanted new hearts when our hearts get old and die. One way of being immortal is to have a new heart printed or a new set of lungs printed. So one reason why this happened is because rich people want to have immortality, and so they'll bung information and money at organ printing. Okay, and there's also a lot of stories by Larry Niven where the same sort of thing is where you have a new organ grown for you when your old ones die. So why in options they said you had an entire new body and you had a brain transplant, that's not necessary. But the idea is still there, and that's probably where hopefully the research will go in the future. So we'll see. Okay, so just coming to the summary at the end. Sci-fi, hopefully, maybe you've convinced, I don't know, I may not have convinced you. Sci-fi, I think is a great way of explaining complex and difficult subjects, because I'm pretty sure even some of you in the audience now are going to be thinking of like, well, hang on, they haven't considered this story and they haven't considered that story, right? And it gives inspiration for you to go away and think about other things. I've also hopefully hoped that I've introduced you to transgender and gender diverse people and made you think about us in a slightly different way. And with some of the scenarios, you can put yourselves into our shoes sort of thing, like how would you feel if you was living in an androgynous society and you wanted to be male or female? Those sort of ideas. If you are worried about, like, just to help you to some degrees, thinking if you are worried about what you can do, how you can be a better ally, okay, if you think, hopefully I'll convince you it's important, there are actually a really few simple things you can do, okay? Generally treat us like anyone else, okay? Just be a nice person. I'm sure you're all nice, maybe. Please call us by our preferred names, and also please use the pronouns we ask you to. I haven't corrected that, I apologize. I mean, it's okay to practice, okay? And if someone changes, you know them, okay? You can practice, okay? I was really glad that John has been calling me JJ, even though he told me, like, you're not a JJ. Anyway. So you can practice and you can make the change, and it's a really simple thing. And what that does for people who are trans and gender diverse, it really is very reaffirming and makes us feel a lot better. And it's a simple thing to do. Don't ask intrusive questions. Do put us in contact with other trans people. Okay, so if you do know anyone in academia and they want to have someone to talk to, there's probably someone at the university they can talk to, or they can talk to me. The number of people that keep on sending me messages on Twitter saying, hey, that's cool, and just talking is quite good. And it's a you are not alone to get an extra Doctor Who reference in, right? Yana, you are not alone, feeling that you know that there are other people out there. Do create safe spaces, even if that's just your office. Okay, and this is great because this works for everyone, all the different equity groups. If you have a safe space where people feel like they can be themselves, actually really good. Think about intersectionality. I'm giving you my view as a white trans person, trans women of color, at the bottom of the pile in terms of the privilege ladder. And so, while I've given you a very simple, very white view of this, it's actually a lot more complicated. Yes, I put this in. It's a bit cheesy, but the main thing is just like please let us live long and pee in peace. Okay, or live long and prosper. Okay, it's bad. I know it's bad. I apologize. Okay, I'll leave it there and I'll answer any questions. Thank you very much.